Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Stonington Free Library. This is really exciting to see you all, and welcome, I have to say, to all the people watching us on live stream, which is numbered in thousands, I think so. But thank you so much for being here. It's really, really exciting. This is one of our Sunday evening lecture programs, but I want to say two things. One, to thank the committee for all their hard work for putting these programs together. They really do work incredibly hard. And Carla Umland, our assistant director, is here with her wonderful husband, who is vital tech support this evening. So he came in and did a great deal. So we do appreciate that. But that's the way this library works, actually. So, and the other thing I want to mention is there are bookmarks with all our programs on it, upcoming programs. But May 8th is our next Sunday evening lecture, and that will be our friend Willard Spiegelman. And there are posters around, but put that on your calendar. He's going to talk about his work writing for the Wall Street Journal about art. So we're really looking forward to that. And now comes this great moment, which I have been looking forward to with great excitement for a long time, and that is to have Professor Kenneth Bleeth here to talk about Chaucer. And this sort of came about because last year there was a sudden kind of flurry of attacks on Chaucer. Let's get rid of him. Let's drop him from the curriculum, and I forget why. He was kind of a dead white male, I guess. But of course, Stonington Library couldn't allow that. So right here, we had Professor Bleeth, who is a lifelong expert on Chaucer and also medieval studies. He's Professor Emeritus of English at Connecticut College, where he was head of the Medieval Studies program, which included Chaucer, Dante, Renaissance poetry, all our favorite things. And this kind of simple few words actually talks of a lifetime of devotion and scholarship and writing and studies and teaching in this field. So we couldn't really have more of an expert to tell us about our favorite April poet. So, Kenneth Bleeth.
Thank you, Belinda.
Oh. Do we have to do this? Okay. We have to extra microphone. We have to do that. Just a lapel mic for the folks at home.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this is built in, and you'll just forget it's there.
I will, yeah. I wanted to thank a couple people. Belinda, first of all, whose bright idea this was in the first place, and the library, Michaela, and particularly Carla Umland, who set up the slides you're going to see. I certainly couldn't have done that myself. She did this speedily and efficiently, and I'm very grateful. It may have occurred to some of you that the date or the timing of this talk is not altogether accidental, since it was in April. April with his schuras salta, April with its sweet showers, that Chaucer sent his band of pilgrims off to the shrine of St. Thomas a Becket in Canterbury on their famous pilgrimage. Scholars can never leave well enough alone, and so there have been attempts to pin down the exact date in April when the pilgrimage might have begun. This fictional pilgrimage might have begun. April 18th seems to be a popular candidate. So if you believe that, we are just about a week off, which is close enough. The 17th century poet, playwright, essayist John Dryden famously wrote of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, "Here is God's plenty." We have an hour now, 55 minutes, right, which is not going to be enough to do justice to God's plenty. So I picked two quite specific subjects that I want to focus on. I want to start by talking about what it meant for Chaucer and what it means for us as his modern readers that he was a poet writing in a manuscript tradition, that is, writing approximately a century before the introduction of printing into England. It's a very nice coincidence that the first book that was printed in England in 1476 by William Caxton, the famous printer and writer, was in fact an edition of the Canterbury Tales. So there's a nice symmetry there. And then I'll switch gears and we'll spend some time with one of the most engaging and I should say controversial of Chaucer's pilgrim tale-tellers, the wife of Bath, whose name is Alice, also called Alisoun in her prologue and tale. And I should say ahead of time that there is a prologue, quite lengthy prologue, and a shorter tale, and I'm going to be spending most of my time talking about the prologue itself. What you see on the screen is a 7-line poem that appears in a mid-15th century miscellany, which is in Trinity College, Cambridge. And the miscellany was assembled by a man named John Shirley, who was himself a writer, a book collector, and a scribe. And since we're going to be talking about scribes, I should just say that a scribe in the Middle Ages was someone who was hired to copy out a copy or multiple copies of something that someone else had written. That was how books, texts were disseminated. What you see on the left is a modern transcription of this short poem. What you see on the right is an image of the poem as it appears in Shirley's manuscript. And what I will do is I will say the poem to you and then I'll translate it. And by the way, the title in the manuscript, hang on. Oh, there we go. The title in the manuscript is Chaucer's, or actually Chaucer's Wordes a Geoffrey unto Adam his own scrivein. And scrivein means scribe. It's like the word scrivener, as in Bartleby, the scrivener. Adam scrivein, if ever it they befalla boes or troilus tortoriten nioa, under the longa locus du must have the scala, but after me mocking du rit more troa. So oft did I emote the work renella, it to correct, and ache to rub, and scrapa, and all is thirsty negligence and rapa. Adam, scribe, if it ever happens that you copy out again Boes, which is my translation of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, a long prose treatise, or Troilus, which is my 5-book poem on the tragic love of Troilus and Cressida during the Trojan War. May you have the skull under your long locks. Skull is apparently a particularly unpleasant scalp disease, like ringworm. May you have the skull under your long locks, unless you write more accurately in accordance with what I have written, my mucking. So often, every day, I have to fix your work, correct it, and rub and scrape. I'll get back to that in a second. And all is through your negligence and haste. Uh, Ruben Scarapa describes how you make corrections on a parchment or a vellum manuscript. You take a penknife and you scrape off the offending or incorrect letters, and then you rub that with a pumice stone to smooth it out, and then you rewrite. Whoops, and what I have here, this is um, a 15th century manuscript, which, and the two areas that are marked, and I don't know whether it comes across clearly, have been rubbed and scraped, and something new has been put down on them. And this was a very laborious process for the person who's making the corrections. The poem is in the form of a curse. Unless you do this, may this thing happen to you. The tone of the poem is, well, up for grabs, let's say. It could be that Adam really was a terrible scribe, and Chaucer was genuinely angry at the mistakes he made. More likely is that it's a kind of familiar joking between the author and the person who's hired. It's been pointed out that if Adam really were a wretched scribe, that Chaucer wouldn't even consider allowing him to rewrite Boethius and Troilus. And it's also possible that Chaucer may have felt some responsibility himself for the mistakes because the copy that he gave or that gave to Adam was not in very good shape. It was full of corrections and marginalia and so on. It also seems to me that, although I've never seen this in any scholarly literature, that he may be giving Adam a gentle hint that he needs a haircut under the longa lacus dum mortav the scala. But it has been pointed out that there's a very nice irony in a scribe, whether it's Adam or some other scribe, copying out a poem, the subject of which is the incompetence of scribes. I have two major points that I want to make about what we can derive from this poem. First is that whether Chaucer was joking or not, whether Chaucer was joshing or not, that he really did care about what happened to his writing, about the posterity of his writing. There are some lines at the end of Troilus and Cressida, which is a long poem, which have often been paralleled to the Adam poem. So he's sending his poem off into the world. He says, "Go, little book, go, little book. So pray God that non misrita they, ne they mismetra for the fault of tongue. I pray to God that no one miswrites you or mismeters you because of the default or fault of their tongue, some sort of linguistic incompetence or insufficiency." It would be possible to say, well, this is all kind of unremarkable because what writer doesn't care about what happens to his or her work when it goes out into the world? Why, in other words, why should we even pay attention to this? But the sense that a writer owns his or her work was a somewhat new phenomenon by the time Chaucer was writing. If you look at, and I'm just restricting this to literary texts, but you could apply this to art history and other artistic productions. If you look at literary texts from earlier in the Middle Ages, you'll find that the most prolific author, so to speak, is anonymous. Okay? Sometimes it comes with a further identification, anonymous of York. Okay? And a lot of very important early medieval works have no identifiable author. Beowulf, for example, the Germanic, the old German, Middle German poem, the Nibelungenlied, the French song of Roland, the Chanson de Roland. Lots of lyrics, hundreds of lyrics, romances, they're all written by anonymous. And in the case of some of these poems, the French Song of Roland would be a good example. What we really have is not a finished work which you can attribute to a unique writer, but rather an aggregate of multiple versions which have been written and rewritten over time. All this is connected with the notion of oral transmission, which I don't have time to get into, but some of you certainly know about that. At least one famous modern writer didn't have much use for this idea of communal authorship. Find here are my glasses, right? Nabokov, Vladimir Nabokov, translated the 12th century Russian heroic poem, the Song of Roland, Song of Igor's Campaign. And in his introduction, he says that the Song of Igor's Campaign is the lucid work of one man, not the random thrum of a people or the gradual accretion of lumpy parts, which is so typical of folklore. So much for communal authorship, according to Nabokov. In the late 13th, 14th century, we begin to get more names. Dante, of course, other Italian writers, Boccaccio, Petrarch, Chaucer's contemporaries, Langland, who wrote Piers Plowman, Gower, Hakluyt, and fame became a subject for these writers. One of Chaucer's earlier poems is called The House of Fame, and he says that the House of Fame is built on a large block of ice. Right? So it's the idea that fame is a fickle thing. And so to talk about fame and to be interested in fame as a writer is a way of worrying about or perhaps preserving your works and your name as a writer. If you think ahead a bit, more than a bit, to Shakespeare's sonnets, there are moments where Shakespeare talks precisely about this. Not marble nor the gilded monuments of princes shall outlive this powerful rhyme. That is claiming a kind of eternity for his works. Or more famous poem, Sonnet 29, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, which ends, so long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So again, back to Chaucer, he wanted his works which had his name on it to be properly copied and properly transmitted to whoever's going to be reading them. My second point has to do with what can happen to a written text, a manuscript text, when it's copied out by a scribe. You all know that if you've ever copied out a longish passage in longhand, in your own handwriting, mistakes creep in. Okay, and this happened certainly in the copying of medieval manuscripts. In fact, paleographers, people who study handwriting, have devised names for some of these errors. I skip, for example, or ditography, which means when you copy something accidentally more than once. So there are various kinds of problematic scribes. You have inattentive or sloppy scribes like Adam. You have scribes who, when they run into an unfamiliar word, will substitute a word that they know better. Okay. You have puritanical scribes, censorious scribes, who omit or edit or change passages that made them uncomfortable, sometimes about religious things, sometimes about political things, most often about erotic matters. There are plenty of those in Chaucer. I'll give you one example in a tale called the Manciple's Tale, which involves Phoebus Apollo and his unfaithful wife. and a talking crow. This is a story from Ovid. There's one particularly cringeworthy moment when the crow, who's been watching the wife when Phoebus is away, tells Phoebus that the wife's been unfaithful to him with a man of a lower social station. So, digs the knife. And what Chaucer wrote, this is the crow speaking to Phoebus, is, "For in the bed the wife I saw him swiva." In your bed I saw him, and swiva is a slang word for copulation. You know what word it is, right? In Middle English, in the bed the wife I saw him swiva. In one of the manuscripts of the Canterbury Tales, the manuscript reads, "For in the bed the wife I saw him, etc." And he uses the abbreviation for etc. So that's a scribe, a puritanical scribe at work. You have scribes who think they're better writers than the people they're copying, and they go about improving the text. And you also have scribes who make marginal comments of their own, and I'll show you an example of that when we get to the wife of Bath's Tale. The errors that Adam makes or made were sufficiently troublesome for Chaucer that he actually, if you take this poem as recording something autobiographical, he took the trouble actually to laboriously correct the errors himself. And to have a writer physically involved in the physical production of a manuscript, as Chaucer was here, is somewhat unusual. That is, usually you leave that to the scribe, you leave that to the bookbinder, you leave that to the illuminator. But Chaucer said, with some annoyance, I had to take all this time every day to clear up your errors. Why does all this matter for us as modern readers of Chaucer? Or another way to put it is, when we have a volume entitled Chaucer's Works or Chaucer's Poetry in our hand, what is it that we are reading? And what I say here, it applies obviously not only to Chaucer, but to other early writers. Wait, I've got another slide. Whoops. Yeah. What you have here is the opening page, the opening folio of the most famous manuscript of the Canterbury Tales, the so-called Ellsmere Manuscript. This is the one, and I'll show you an example of that in just a bit, with the little miniature portraits of each pilgrim going along with his or her tale. This manuscript is in the Huntington Library in San Marino, California. And this is the page, the beginning of the Canterbury Tales, which has those lines that you were all made to memorize in, shall we? Juan that April with his sure, well, you know what I'm saying, okay? This is the version of this in the latest and really good, excellent edition of Chaucer, the Norton Chaucer, edited by David Lawton. And I put them side by side. You can see that in the modern text, if you read, the poem seems to move along seamlessly, no little gaps, no little hiccups. It has helpful glosses in the right margin. It has additional information that you might need in the at the bottom. What you have to know when you read such a book is that this text is an artificial creation of the editorial process. That is to say that it represents an editor's, and when you have an edition of say, Chaucer, it's edited by so-and-so, okay? It represents the editor's hypothesis based on the editor's examination of manuscripts and of his knowledge of Chaucer's works in general and so forth and so on. His editor's hypothesis of what it is most likely that Chaucer probably wrote. In other words, when if you say I was reading Chaucer, you have to realize that you are reading it through many steps that were taken by not only your editor, but also editors who preceded him. There are some 88 manuscripts of the Canterbury Tales. Some of them are fragmentary, and at least theoretically, any modern text of Chaucer would be produced by the editors examining all the manuscripts and all the variations from manuscript to manuscript, because once again, if you think scribes are writing these manuscripts, they're copying, they're doing things differently from another scribe. So all the manuscripts are in small ways, or in sometimes very large ways, different from each other. This kind of work has been made infinitely easier by digitized and computer searchable text. You can imagine what would be like before then to actually look at the manuscripts or photocopies of the manuscripts. So when a scholar refers to Skeat's Chaucer or Donaldson's Chaucer or Robinson's Chaucer, that is the names of the editors, it's not just a kind of shorthand. It really does mean that these texts were produced by editors, and to that extent, you can't really know how close or how far they are from what Chaucer might actually have written, because we don't have any autographed copies of any of Chaucer's writings. Finally, who is this guy Adam? Right? Adam was a quite common name in the Middle Ages, but that didn't stop scholars for several centuries from trying to identify a particular scribe who Chaucer might have been addressing. They came up with several candidates, but nothing definitive. And at one point, they pretty much gave up and began to do interpretive readings. For example, that just as the first Adam made a huge mistake in Eden, so this Adam made a lot of smaller mistakes. Okay. At a conference of the New Chaucer Society, I said this to someone said, "What happened to the old Chaucer Society?" The conference of the New Chaucer Society in Glasgow in 2004, a scholar named Lynn Mooney, who taught at the University of York, dropped a bombshell. Mooney knew that the two earliest and best manuscripts of the Canterbury Tales, the Ellsmere, and another manuscript called the Hengert manuscript, Hengwrt, which is in Wales, the National Library at Wales. The two best and earliest manuscripts of the Canterbury Tales were almost certainly copied by the same scribe. In other words, serious students of medieval paleography have read enough manuscripts that they can identify distinctive or unique characteristics of some particular scribe's handwriting and say, scribe A copied this manuscript from that manuscript. She knew this. She was doing some research on documents by London scribes, 14th century London scribes in the Guildhall Library, the Library of the Guildhall in London, and she came upon a Scriveners' Company common paper dated 1392, and this common paper is essentially an elaborate oath of loyalty to the Scriveners' Guild that you belong to. And she noticed that the handwriting was really just like the handwriting of the Ellesmere and the Ellsmere Manuscript. And here's the document. She noticed that the scribe who had signed this document was one Adam Pinkhurst. His John Hancock is there, right? He obviously wasn't shy about it. There, I was at the talk, and there really was a collective gasp from the audience. I mean, it may not seem like earth shaking to you, but it was to that audience. Finally, usually the proceedings of scholarly conferences don't make it into the newspapers, but the Guardian, London Guardian, had, I don't know whether it was a headline, but it was prominent. The Scrivener's Tale, how Chaucer's sloppy copyist was unmasked after 600 years. After 600 years, it was his handwriting that gave him away. Inevitably, in the years that have passed, 15, 20 years that have passed since, Mooney expanded her talk into a long, very scholarly article, which was published in the primary volume of medieval studies called the journal called Speculum. Inevitably, there has been some dissent from that, and it's ongoing. But wherever the discussion ends up, Mooney's identification seems to contain a fair amount of plausibility, and so it's nice to think that we have the signature of a man who may have been in the same room with Geoffrey Chaucer. Let me take a little break here and ask you if you have comments or questions about what I've just said. Yes, sir.
Thinking about the Scrivener, if Chaucer was so disappointed, critical of him, is he in no position to dismiss him, replace him, admonish him in a more formal relationship way with Chaucer?
I think he probably might have been. I don't know any examples of that happening. But again, I think that it is a better reading of this poem, the Adam Scrivener poem, is that, Adam made some mistakes, but, I've worked with him for a long time, and it's two guys kind of, that kind of joshing, so this is going to happen to you, buddy, if you mess up again.
Wasn't more global in the sense that Chaucer was finally getting it off his chest, that he had it, with Scriveners in general taking liberties with what he had so lawfully supposed.
Well, I mean, this is the only instance I can think of in his poetry where he addresses or refers to a scribe. I made one of it is a footnote. Chaucer's day job was not as a writer. He had a number of important jobs. The one he had for the longest time was as a collector of customs in the London port. So in the House of Fame, the poem that I mentioned before, he I'm trying to simplify it. He's told by an eagle who lifts him up and gives him a tour that, when he says, when you get home after you've made all your reckonings, thou sittest at another book till fully dasward is they look. You after you put away your business books, right, your customs records, you go home and you sit on another book until your look is complete, your eyes are completely dazed. And here he's talking about Chaucer, presumably writing his poetry. But there's a very important book called the Chaucer Life Records, which has 400 odd documents which are somehow related to Geoffrey Chaucer. Not one of those 400 odd documents refers to him as a writer, as a poet, that is, right? Okay, it's almost as if Chaucer the poet and Chaucer public servant, right, were two different people. They weren't, but you couldn't know that he was a writer from any of the records. Any other questions? Yeah, I guess.
Are there lots of corrections in these two manuscripts by Adam that seem to justify Chaucer's little rant about his error?
Sorry, would you say that again?
So, are there in the two manuscripts by Adam?
Oh yeah, in Boethius and Prose. Yeah.
Are there lots of corrections?
Oh, the manuscripts that we have of Boyce and Troilus are not necessarily ones that Adam might. Yeah. Okay. Right. That is the hand that's identified in this document and in the two manuscripts of the Canterbury Tales that I mentioned is not the hand that wrote any of the manuscripts of Troilus. That if that were the case, then we'd have lots to work with, right? But alas, that's not the case. No, no. Hand in the back, yeah. Were there copies of copies? Oh yeah, yeah. Oh, absolutely. In fact, the manuscript tradition, right, of a French medieval poem called the Roman de la Rose, the Romance of the Rose. Okay, it's extraordinarily popular, a bestseller. Okay, exists in 300 copies, right, and inevitably, one manuscript is copied from another manuscript. So the short answer is yes, absolutely. And what modern editors try to do, or at least tried to do, was to make family trees, of manuscripts. That is, if these 6 manuscripts show the same errors, okay, then one was probably copied from another, and so on and so forth. Editors have pretty much given up on that. They've given up on trying to find a scientific way of getting the best text. But nevertheless, yes, that absolutely is true. Yeah. He had a son named Thomas Chaucer, right? And he wrote something called the Treatise on the Astrolabe. An astrolabe is an astronomical device, okay? And he addresses the treatise in a preface to little Louis, my son. There's no other evidence of little Louis. And I don't envy little Louis trying to read this treatise. But there is a Thomas Chaucer, and there is information about him, and I can't recall exactly where it goes. So at some point, the line dies out, so we don't have a lot of Chaucers around. Yeah, Belinda.
So, Ken, with all these,
Yeah.
with all these different manuscripts,
Mm-hmm.
you must have studied them endlessly before the digital age.
Who must have studied them? No. Well, first of all, there aren't that many in the States. There are some. They're at Yale, at Harvard, at the New York Public Library. The Morgan Library actually has a remarkable collection of manuscripts.
So my question is, with all these different manuscripts and all these different editors, isn't an essential source of voice where you can say somehow this is still a central source? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Let's see how I can answer this in a simple way. In discussions of the act or the art or the science of editing, one school of thought is that if you've spent enough time with your favorite writer, favorite poet, okay, you can recognize by a kind of instinct the Chaucerian and voice, okay? And therefore, you can know whether a line in the manuscript would be what Chaucer probably wrote or something that his scribe had meddled with, right? I mean, I'm not endorsing this myself wholeheartedly, but this is kind of what's replaced that family tree thing. The way you get at the best reading is by knowing. It's a little bit like I hope I'm not distorting this. Connoisseurship in art history, where you just know it's Rubens' hand or something like that. Okay. Well, that's what is claimed by editors who use this, and some very great editors, Talbot Donaldson from Yale, a man named George Kane, who they both edited Piers Plowman. But I don't claim, that, but that's what they believe, that they really know if a line is Chaucerian or not. Okay, is that sort of what you were getting at or not? Okay, all right. Okay. Anything else? Yeah, Julie. Hey, you take off your mask. I can't hear. Yeah, as they say, that's a good question. There are different theories about that. There are a couple. Did Chaucer revise? Um, I have no doubt that in early drafts he must have revised, although we don't have any of those drafts. But there are a couple of places in his work where there are, well, the best example is there's a poem called The Legend of Good Women, and it has a prologue, a preface, and he has two versions of it. One, he rewrote it. So that, in a sense, is a rewriting. And there are a couple of other spots where there are clear places where he revised. There are other hypotheses. There's, for example, there's a hypothesis that Troilus and Cressida was extensively revised. So you have an A version, a B version, a C version. That probably isn't right, but I think he did revise, right? How much? We don't know. Yeah. Hand in the back. Yeah. Yeah. Well, just as I said about editions, that they are hypotheses. Our speaking reproduction of Middle English it's a hypothesis, and there are a couple of ways. There are certain laws or rules of sound change, right, that seem to apply across many languages, and you can follow those. All right. Rhyme words are often useful. If two words rhyme, you may not know for sure how they were pronounced, but you know that they were probably pronounced the same way. There are discussions of language by contemporaries in the North. They spoke rather roughly, blah, blah, blah. So, but it's those things pieced together. There's no, there's no definitive way of knowing. And what tends to happen when people read Middle English is that they speak it with a bit of whatever other foreign language they know the best. If you're studying French, it comes out a little French. In fact, one of the great students of English pronunciation, the man who taught at Yale, his name was Helge Kirkeritz. You can tell from his name he was Scandinavian. He was Swedish. And he did some early recordings of Middle English, which on the one hand are presumably impeccable, but everything has that little lilt, so you feel like you've watched an Ingmar Bergman movie a bit. So, yeah. So, and also you imitate your teachers. I imitated my teacher imitated his teacher, blah, 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 blah. So, yeah, sure. All right. See where we are. Oh my goodness. Well, we're not going to get nearly as much of the Life of Bath as I had hoped, but what can you do? Let me just see what I want to leave out. A lot. The Canterbury Tales are assigned to different speakers, okay? And the speakers are all given portraits in the general prologue: the knight, the miller, the reeve, the clerk, the prioress, etc., the wife of Bath. And um, in one way of thinking, each tale is exactly adapted to the status, the calling, the personal quirks of the pilgrim speaker. That, I think, is an exaggeration. However, there are a few tales in which the voice of the speaker is unmistakable, right? Or it is an unmistakable voice, and that certainly is true about the wife of Bath prologue and tale. That is, her voice dominates. It's all spoken in first person. There are no authorial comments. Uh, Her voice dominates the prologue and tale from beginning to end. Let me just get to the page I need here. And alas, I'm going to have to skip her portrait in the general prologue, just because there's not enough time, but just let me move along here. This is that portrait, Godwin Wasser de Bath. This is the miniature of the wife of Bath, which accompanies her tale in the Ellsmere Manuscript. And if you read this, you see that her clothing is described. She has a big hat, as broad as is a buckler or a targe. She's armed for battle, so to speak. A buckler or a target, a shield. So those are her characteristics in the general prologue. But here is the beginning of her prologue. And in her prologue, we are plunged directly into a conversation which has been, so to speak, going on. That is, the other half of the dialogue we have to imagine ourselves because we only have our words. But what I like to imagine as a kind of antecedent scenario is that somebody has been saying to the wife of Bath, well, you know, there are all these great authorities, all these great men who have written endlessly, written voluminously, St. Paul, St. Jerome, St. Ambrose, about what a lousy deal marriage is for men. Your wives will talk incessantly. They will want new clothes, right? They will distract you from what you ought to really be doing, which is studying scripture and so on. And this is all unimpeachable written authority. And I like to think that her prologue is her having heard enough of that and saying, experience, though non auctorite within the world, is recht enough for me to speak of war that is in marriage. And you sort of have to have sarcastic quotes over authority. Okay, and I realize, by the way, that the font here is probably not visible in the back, and I'm sorry about that. She speaks at this point. Her voice bursts out as the voice of experience countering written authority. But one of the remarkable things about her prologue, and it's a long piece of writing, it's almost 1,000 lines, is that much of what she says is taken from, quoted from, cited from, paraphrased from the very authorities that she's setting herself up against. But what she does is not simply quote it verbatim. She quotes it in a way that allows her to turn it to her own polemical purposes. And let me see if I can give you one or two good examples of this. And she employs exactly the same techniques as her opponents, right, do. That is, citing scripture and commenting on it. Technical term was glossing, right? To gloss another text is to write your comment on it. And if you look at medieval Bibles, you find there are glosses in the margin, there are glosses between the lines, and so on. She is talking about how many times a woman, she in particular, can get married. And what you learn in the general prologue is whose bonus at Chirchidor she had fever. She'd been married 5 times. Okay, so she's something of an authority on. Let me see where I want to be here. Let me also see where. Here's the clicker. Yeah. She cites a passage from the Gospel of John, in which Christ goes to a wedding in Cana, and therefore, she says, it should be around, no, give me a second. Yeah, Christ sees the Samaritan woman, okay, at a well, and he says to her, quoting, "Du hast had 4 husbands, quod he, and that ilke man that nu hast is not din husband." And there she is quoting Christ in Scripture. And the wife of Bath says, "Vus seid he, certain." He certainly did say this. But what he meant there be, he cannot say. But did he ask we that the 5th man was non-husband to the Samaritan? How many might she have in marriage? Yet heard ye never tellen in min age upon this nombre definition. One of the things the wife of Bath does is she uses at strategic points words that are long and Latinate and scholastic. That is the very sort of words that St. Jerome, St. Ambrose would be using. But the context and her voice makes those words, those terms seem silly, right? A definition, okay? She also does kind of selective quotation. Let's see. She says, "Men may divine and gloss and up and down, but well he what express without lia. God bade us for to wax and multiply. That gentle text he can well understand." Okay. Well, as it's often pointed out, the wife of Bath, who seems to tell you everything about herself, never mentions children, right? So it's a little odd if she did not have children, right? That she would then quote that. Another quick example of her using lexical items to make her point. She says that God said, or Christ said, that a husband should, that my husband should leave his father and mother and take to me, but of no nombra mention madahe of bigamia or of octogamia. Okay, again, yeah. All right, we've got 5 minutes. Let's see. Let me skip ahead, and you'll just have to, pull your dusty copy of Canterbury Tales off your shelf and look for yourself at More of the Wife of Bath. But I'll just give you one, and this I'll run just a tiny bit over. One of the things that happens in the Wife of Bath prologue is that Chaucer, or let's say the Wife of Bath, right? Give her the agency. Take passages from misogynist writings and deepen and make them deeper and more complex and no longer satirical. And wait, just got to get to the right page here. She's been, well, skip that. Oh gosh, I can't skip this. Wait. Wait. At one point, she quotes for her own purposes what men say or what these authorities say about women. She says to other women, "Ye wees weavers, Thus shall she spake, and bade him wrong on hand. This is what you should, how you should accuse your husband. For half so bodily can there no man swear and lean as a woman can, right? Okay, that's something that gets said again and again. And here's a Cambridge manuscript of this passage in the Canterbury Tales that I just quoted, and you'll see that this is where those lines occur, half so bold, and etc. And the scribe has written something in the margin there. And what the scribe has written next to those lines is, can anybody make, those are two words in Latin, can anybody decipher those? That's the verum est. That's true. He couldn't resist putting that in. One last thing. All right, I will just simply read you this passage. And this is, to my mind, the greatest thing in her prologue. She's been talking about her fourth husband, who she says he was a reveler, he had a paramour, and when she was with him, she had, in general, had a wonderful time. She drank a lot, she danced, and she says, after wine, on Venus must I think. And one thing leads to another in her mind, and after that, she's talking about that in the middle paragraph. She says, and just bear with me, I know I'm running over my hour. She says, but Lord Christ, one that it remembereth me upon me youth and on me jollity, it tickleth me about mine herte rote. Unto this day it doth mine herte bote that I have had me world as in me tema. But age, alas, that all will envenima hath me bereft me beauty and me pith. Let go, farewell, the devil go therewith. The food is gone, there is no more to tell her. The bran, as he best can, no must he sell her. But yet to be richt merrier will he fonda, nu will he tellen of me fourth husband. A little earlier, she says that she is 40 years old, okay, which was older in the Middle Ages than it is now. Like all great moments of characterization, this passage is complex, right? It has laughter in it, right? It tickleth me about min herte rota when she thinks back. And it's not only in the past, she says, unto this day it doth mean herte bota, that he hath had me world as in me king. It has pathos, ye have had me world as in me tema. It has things that you could criticize. She says that, let's see, the floor is gone, there is no more to tell her. The bran as he best can, no must he sell her. Okay, throughout the prologue, there's a mercantile streak in her. And then there are things which you simply sit back and admire. She says, I'm not going to let all this get me down. I'll do my best to be merry. And let's see, where are we? In other words, she doesn't allow herself to become bitter. She says, let go, farewell, the devil go therewith. You have to be richt media fully fonda, nu willy tellen of me fourth husband. She sort of picks herself up and pulls herself together and moves along with her story. So this is, this is as good as Chaucer gets, I think. It's pretty good. Okay, I could answer some questions if anybody wants to stick around. Yeah. I'm sorry, I can't hear you, Jeff. I had a very good course in college, um, and the teacher, I realize now, wasn't really much of a scholar, but he sold. This is Bill Alfred at Harvard. He was a playwright. He was a poet. He was um, an Irish raconteur, right? And more, yeah, yeah. And he made it absolutely irresistible, even though much of the class was about Robert Lowell or about his grandmother in Brooklyn. It didn't matter, and he was a wonderful reader. So that got me hooked. Yeah, I mean, I realized after the fact that he sort of made up an awful lot of stuff, but it didn't matter. Didn't matter. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.